Director of Assistance Funding and Cards in DCJ.
Cool, thanks for that, Dan. Welcome everybody to the final information session. And this is for current DCJ service providers that we've invited to apply for the NGO flood recovery program. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that we're all meeting on Aboriginal land. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal colleague in the session today, and recognise that we're here to support and serve Aboriginal communities with all the work that they do with DCJ. Today's session is going to go through in a bit of detail what's in our program guideline, and also walk you through the application process in Smart Grants as well. We'll talk about the program in more detail, but it's really about the flood event from last year, the August, September, and it was carried on a little bit into October, November, as well as the flood waters move through the state in central and western New South Wales. We know there's a long tail when it comes to big natural disasters, and communities and service providers, or NGO service providers in particular, have increased need for their services, and also new services or changes to how they deliver support to their community. So that's what this program is all about. We'll go through in quite a bit of detail what the program is designed for, and what expenditure can be used from the grant, but also, as importantly, what you can't use the expenditure for. So, if there's already existing grant programs or other funding, particularly around infrastructure itself, they're excluded from this grant round. So yeah, I'll hand over to Dan, who will go through in more detail the actual program, and we have a question and answer session as well, as Dan indicated, if you've got questions about the program or the application process itself. So back to you, Dan.
Thanks, Stephen. So I'm the manager of grant design and support projects at DCJ. So my team are the one who are running the grant program. And to take you a bit through, Sarah, would you be able to flick to the next slide? So this is the sort of standard text we want to get out there. So the Commonwealth and New South Wales governments have launched a $9.1 million grant program to support communities to recover from the central and western New South Wales floods that commenced in August, September 2022, as Stephen was saying. So it is co-funded by both the Commonwealth and the New South Wales government. It's open to NGOs, Aboriginal organisations, community organisations, and DCJ service providers. It does need to involve human services. And they must be provided to individuals and families and communities that are located in the LGA's designated disaster areas under AGRN 1030 and 1034. Don't expect that to mean anything to you. That's the official government designation of a disaster. So the August-September floods are classed as AGRN 1030 and 1034. The important, and when they do that, they declare certain areas disaster areas. In this case, quite a wide range of areas across New South Wales were designated disaster areas, and you can see those LGAs listed on the right-hand side. And that should be noted that that's LGA designated disaster areas that also fit within the DCJ districts of Western Murrumbidgee, Far Western New England. And as you're all from service providers, you know which one of those you're in. The NGO Flood Recovery Program is based on the successful Northern New South Wales NGO Flood Support Program, which was launched last year in response to the Northern New South Wales floods in February last year. And so this program is based very closely on that model. Do you want to go to the next slide, Sarah? Cheers. So what does the NGO Flood Recovery Program do? It provides one-off grants to NGOs and Aboriginal organisations to help address the difficulties you're experiencing. Firstly, meeting increased demand for core services. So we know that in the response to a flood event or any sort of disaster, there's obviously an increased demand for your core services. The people who are vulnerable communities are the most affected often by these things, plus you then have more members of the community who end up in the vulnerable category. It's also intended to address the need for new services. So we know that in the response to the floods, a lot of NGOs and organisations started providing new services or programs, whether that's from example I always throw in was that when we're doing the Northern New South Wales program, like there was a counselling service who ended up setting up a food kitchen in their kitchen because they were able to do that. So anything like that, anything that you've launched since August, September 2022 to help meet the needs of people who've been affected by floods or are definitely covered by this grant program. And it's also about managing the impact of floods on staff and volunteers. We know that like when the floods have their impact, it has a strong impact on staff and volunteers. They often are firstly, they're overloaded initially, plus the workload continues, people get burned out, there can be a higher turnover, recruitment can be more difficult. And so this this grant program is intended to sort of cover that as well. If you're in this call, you've been invited to apply for a closed competitive grant. So you've received a specific invitation to apply, and that's based on your local DCJ district have identified. They went through and identified the current DCJ service providers who they believed were likely to have been affected or were affected and would have capacity to assist in this, to provide assistance. And so that's how you were selected. To apply for either grant, closed competitive or open competitive, is all through Smarty Grants in the one form. So you've been sent an application to apply for a closed competitive grant with a total funding pool available of $1.1 million, and grants range from 50 to 100,000. You would have, in the email you were sent, it would have designated what amount you are being invited to apply for. That said, you are still eligible to apply for the open competitive grant at the same time. You can't receive both grants, but you will be considered for both grants in the same application form. And that's because open competitive grants, for one thing, have a wider range of dollars available. It's $10,000 to $200,000, but also because we don't know which of these streams is going to be the most competitive, and we didn't want people invited to apply for a closed competitive grant to be knocked out in a really competitive process there, but then not have the chance to apply for the open grant. We're going to go through at the end of this session, as we were saying before, we're having this session, then a Q&A, and then a run through of the Smarty Grants application process. So if you haven't applied through Smarty Grants before, you can actually see what it looks like to do it, and that give you a sense of what the forms look like and stuff like that. But you can at any time, by following the link there, the dcj.smartygrants.com.au, which also I believe was in the email and is available on our website. You can always go in and have a look and see what the form looks like without actually having to start your application, or even us knowing that you've looked at it. Like, we won't have any record of that until you actually sign in. Can we go to the next page, Sarah? So the features of the program. The biggest one that I want to emphasize that is not project-based. So usually when you apply for a grant, most grants are out there are asking you to say, here, we have a new project that we want to run. Please provide us with X amount of dollars to run this project. That's not what this program is about. This is about applying for funding to meet the increased demand for services that you're already facing. Whether that's the core services you were providing long before the floods eventuated, or new services provided since the flood. It's about covering that core capability and finding a way to provide extra funding for that. Part of the fact that we do know that, when we know that you're all understaffed and overworked and don't have a heck of a lot of free time. And so that's why it was really important to us, particularly in response to a disaster, to make sure that the application and reporting process was as easy as possible. I don't think if you've ever applied for a grant through New South Wales or Commonwealth Government before, you will have ever seen a grant process, application process simpler than this one. We've really made a strong effort to make this as easy to do as possible, and to not mean that you're devoting hours and hours of your time and resources to completing application forms. And that flows onto the reporting forms. The reporting forms are similarly simplified compared to other grant programs. And I should note that this when you get a grant, that's outside the annual accountability process that you already do for other DCJ stuff. So you won't need to account for that there. It's just a separate reporting process through Smarty Grants. Part of the way we've simplified it is the fact that you don't need to provide a detailed budget or a detailed project plan. So this is really show you the difference between this and other grant programs is that this one has a, to describe what you're going to use for the funding, you have a 200-word text field to complete. You're not providing a project plan with dates and here are all the milestones we're going to hit. That's not what this is about. And while there is a proposed expenditure table, there is no detailed budget. So rather than usually when you're doing something like this, you'd be expected to, be really exact about how much money you're expecting to spend on each thing. So, you might be writing, might be down to a level of I'm spending $600 on $626 on paper clips, and I think my staffing is going to cost $17,200, and I've got to sit there and work out lead balance and stuff like that. That's not what this is about. This is asking for, in this proposed expenditure table, you're providing high-level estimates only to give us a sense of the proportion of the funding you're asking for that you expect to be devoted to various different forms of expenditure, but you don't have to provide really detailed information. And the benefit of that is not only here where you're doing this initial application to make it simpler, but it also gives you the benefit of there's a bit more flexibility involved. So as it says, the grants allow you to adapt your supporters' needs change, and part of that is because you've provided fairly brief and basic information about what you plan to spend the money on, and you provided a high-level estimates of your proposed expenditure in the proposed expenditure table. But that means that then when you're reporting, that's a similar level of information you're reporting on. Plus, it means that if situations slightly change, we've certainly had this experience with other disaster responses in the past that your need for certain elements of what you're seeking funding on may slightly change in the time, and it will be relatively straightforward that if it's only a minor change, you probably won't even need to come back to us to seek permission. And if it's a more major change, it's a bit easier to cover, and we can probably vary the agreement with very little fanfare. And then probably the change that has the biggest effect day to day is the ongoing support. So I can't emphasize this enough, and you'll hear me say this again and again and again through this presentation, is that we're here to help. We're here to help support you to do your application. And if you're successful, we will provide you with support through the length of your program. That's not just from my team. My team are based in Sydney, and we run the grant program. But a unique feature of this grant program that we copied from the Northern New South Wales program is that there are local flood supporters on the ground to assist. So people who live locally, know your local circumstances, and are able to provide you with assistance. They can provide you assistance now in relation to doing your application, but also ongoing. There'll be an ongoing point of contact with you within DCJ who can answer your questions. You can meet up with and have a chat regularly. They can help you network, find other government support services and that kind of thing. So moving on to assessment requirements. As I said before, like when you're asked to describe the program, you get 200 words to cover that. Then you also, for each of the 5 criteria, have to provide a 200-word response for each. And this is really all there is to the application. In the application form, you provide some really basic information to just make sure you're eligible, things like, what is your ABN kind of thing, what's your bank account details. And then you provide that 200-word description of what you're planning to use for the money, do with the money, and then you're providing 200-word responses to the assessment criteria. Those are the criteria that sit in the program guidelines or on the website, etc. But they are: 1, demonstrate there is an increased demand for your services. That's pretty straightforward as to what that means. 2, you have the capacity to meet the increased demand for the services, and we mean that not only with your current funding, but if you were successful receiving the grant. 3, have the capability to deliver high quality, flexible and sustainable services. So that's a question where we're really asking about, high quality, flexible, sustainable. Those are the 3 keywords that we're looking to cover there. 4th, demonstrate an ability to understand and respond to the changing needs of local communities. That's just to make sure that you're well integrated with your local communities. Obviously, if you're a small organization, that's almost a given, but this is really particularly targeted towards some of the larger organizations, making sure they have a strong understanding of what the need is on the ground and are able to reflect the needs of people on the ground if they come with questions. And the last one is able to fully expend the grant by September 2024. This one, you don't actually have to provide a 200-word answer. It's just a tick box. And this is really just emphasizing the fact that these are one-off grants. So this isn't representing a new source of ongoing funding. This is one-off grants to be spent within 12 months to meet the immediate need in relation to the floods. Could you flip to the next one, Sarah? So here are some of the key things, again, that also make this grant program a little unique. Firstly, reimbursement. You probably, if you've applied for grants from government before, you'll know that like usually you can't seek funding for some funds that have already been expended, but that is not the case here. We know that you've already faced increased expenses due to to the floods, and so up to 25% of the grant you receive can be dedicated directly towards reimbursement of those costs. By that I mean if you apply for a grant of $100,000, 25% of that grant, so $25,000 can be applied directly to reimbursement. You don't need to provide us with paperwork and detailed information on what that reimbursement involves. You just need to tick a box saying that up to 25% of your funding will be dedicated to reimbursement, and then when you're doing that proposed expenditure table, you might split it out a bit and say, of that $25,000, for example, 20,000 of this is to reimburse staff costs that we've incurred since the floods, in response serving our local community affected by the floods. And that's pretty much the level of detail that we required there. Next point is subcontracting. So if your organisation is formally partnering with another organisation or individual providing assistance in the flood, you can subcontract to them, which means that you're still the one making the application. You're still the one who's ultimately, who will be signing, if you're successful, will sign a grant funding agreement with us. We'll ultimately be coming to you for the delivery of the grant and making sure the grant's run, and that's where your contractual responsibility will lie. But you can choose to subcontract to other organisations who might not be eligible to apply for a grant themselves through either the closed or the open competitive grants. That might be because they're a small organisation that doesn't have an ABN. It could be because it's an individual who, we had a lot of examples where, a local person with a truck was providing a lot of ongoing assistance. And so that was a way for them to be able to subcontract some of the work to them. It also fits under what you often hear in other contexts referred to as auspice agreements. So, and that probably fits into those, organisations that aren't in a position to apply themselves. It's that traditional thing of if you're an organisation that for one reason or another is ineligible to apply for grants from government, then you can enter into auspice arrangement with them. So if you have a pre-existing arrangement, as long as it's formalised and written down, that's fine. If it isn't formalised, that would be part of the process that you would need to do, is to have some sort of formal documentation involved to make sure that it's clear that they are agreeing to subcontract with you. But we will never talk to them or chase up with them unless there's some major issue. We would expect that you will run that process. And lastly, on this page, no more than one application per organisation will be approved. So as we discussed, you can use the one application form to apply for both a closed competitive and open competitive grant. So there's no need to do separate application forms for both. We do know, however, that some organisations, because it's not project-based funding, there's no need to apply for one application for one project, one application for another project, etc. But if you're in a situation where you have, 3 outreach officers, have your head office and 3 outreach officers, so you're providing services in 4 different locations that are all helping people affected by the floods, that's completely fine. They can all be in your application, but you can't do a separate application for each one. It does need to be one application per organisation. And if you want to cover a number of different locations or services, you should make sure they're all covered within the same application form. If we do, for whatever reason, receive more than one application from your organisation, we will assess both, but only one will be approved at our discretion. That's a question we will be able to go back on. So I do think that the most logical and strongly encourage you to just put in one application. Sarah, could you move to the next screen? Thank you. So unfortunately, this is always an important thing to get an understanding of what your funding can't be used for. And I should note that all the information that you're seeing here does exist in one form or another in the program guidelines. But funding can't be used for, and I'm just going to step these out so there's some real clarity. And this is more, if you happen to have been involved with the Northern New South Wales Flood Grant Program, I will just note that this is a more limited list than that one. That is partially because this funding has Commonwealth funding attached to it, and they have stronger conditions in some relation to some things. So first thing, you can't use grant funding for expenses that are already covered by other government grants or insurance payments. I think that's probably pretty self-explanatory. It means that, if there's another grant, if you receive funding through another government grant, you can't then double dip and ask for that to apply for that funding again. And the same goes for if you've put in an application for another grant program. If there's other grant programs available to you that would be able to fund these services, then you can't then also seek funding from us and them at the same time and possibly end up with twice the amount of money. And same goes for insurance payments. And included within that is temporary accommodation arrangements. So we know that a lot of organisations were either their main location or their outreach locations were affected by the flood, and they've had to enter into temporary accommodation arrangements. Unfortunately, this grant program no dollars can be put towards that because of the existence of other grant programs that sort of cover that. You can't use funding for infrastructure, equipment, or assets or vehicles. That's a pretty strong line there. So this funding is really about funding staffing, individual supports. You'll see the other things that are covered in the thing, but what it isn't for is buying equipment. So you can't use it to buy a printer. You can't use it to buy a car. It's not, unfortunately, available for those kind of things. Next step, commercial activities. I think that's pretty straightforward, that you can't use the money for that. You can't use it to cover off debts and budget debts incurred prior to the August-September 2022 floods. So I suppose coming back to that reimbursement point, reimbursement's completely fine for costs incurred since the floods in relation to the floods, but it can't cover other existing things that might need to be reimbursed. And again, fairly straightforward. It has to include costs. It has to be 100% devoted to cost related to service delivery. So we often get applications which will say, here's the work we're planning to do. Also, we'd like to attend a conference, or here's the work we're planning to do. Also, we have another linked thing where we want to run an event, for example. Those are not can't be funded through this grant program. It must be all funding we provide must be devoted directly towards service delivery, and that's human service delivery. It's not irrelevant to anyone here, but if you are talking to anyone else, this is limited to organisations that provide human services, so services to people, as opposed to services to the environment or animals or things like that. You can't use funding for interstate or overseas travel. There is a mild carve-out for this. We know some organisations are located quite close to the Victorian border, and so people are crisscrossing all the time. They may have other office over there. In those cases, we can manage that. That's no stress. We can talk about that if you're successful. The main thing is that you can't use it for the kind of proper interstate and overseas travel of the kind of, getting in a plane and booking accommodation, that kind of thing. And lastly, you can't use funding for vouchers. So you can't use it for buying phone, store, or internet credit that you then provide to people who are facing need. If you are wanting to provide individual support to people, you'll see some examples in the guidelines, but that can involve goods like blankets, food, hampers, that kind of thing. But yeah, it can't involve vouchers at all. So if we move to the next and last slide, Sarah. Thank you. So yeah, I can't emphasize enough that we're all about in this providing support. We don't want anyone to die wondering. We are 100% available to answer any questions, but also there's a lot of information already available online. If you go to the dcj.nsw.gov.au NGO flood recovery program.html address, which you've seen at the bottom of all these slides and all other things, that's our DCJ page for the program. It includes program guidelines within the text. There's a downloadable version of the guidelines. There's recordings of previous ones of these sessions if you want to go back and have a look. There's also an FAQs page, which can answer some more complex questions that might have come up. I do encourage you to look there before going anywhere else to find assistance. But in the meantime, we do, my team here, and I might just get my team, everyone but one, I believe, is on the call, Sarah, Ella, and Denise. Just click on their cameras and wave. So this is our team here. We're based in Parramatta. We're if you send an email to this SPC grants team at fax.nsw.gov.au, it appears in all of our inboxes. We will see it and we will attempt to respond straight away. If we can't respond straight away because we're all in a meeting, it'll be as quickly as possible. You won't be waiting days for a response. And while we haven't handed out our phone number because being a small team, we can't man a 9 to 5 phone number, unfortunately. If you do contact us and would prefer to be responded to by phone, or that's by all fine, we can call you back. We do ask that you provide some information on what you're asking about. Like emails which just say, please call me, are kind of difficult to manage, because if we know that your query is about a particular topic, we'll make sure that the person who knows the most about it is the one who calls you back. But yeah, we're here to answer questions. We can set up a Teams meeting if needed. That's fine. Also, as we said before, there are local flood support officers on the ground ready to go. We've got them already involved in Murrumbidgee and Western. So we've got Mandy on the line. She's yep, so she's waving at you now. So she's our representative in Western New South Wales. We've got Annabelle Taylor, who I don't think is on the call today, who represents Murrumbidgee, and we'll have people on board soon for Far Western New England. You can see their email addresses there. They're going to be here for the life of the grant program. They can certainly provide you with quite detailed information. They know as much as we do about how the grant program works. And if they don't know an answer to a question, they can reach out to us as well. Also, if you reach out to us, we may refer you on to them so they can provide you with some support. And they, as I said, they're going to be on board for the life of the grant program. So if you are successful, you'll get used to seeing Mandy and Annabelle's faces. Also involved, New South Wales Reconstruction Authority are 100% across this program. So if you've already got current contacts with the regional delivery team, by all means, contact those people. They will be across this program and they can answer your questions. And lastly, technical assistance. So my team's great at answering questions on 99.9% of topics, but I've lost my password, my screen's not working, I pressed a button and now it's frozen, that kind of thing. We're not IT experts. So if you do have that kind of technical issues, you can see the link there for applicant help through Smarty Grants itself. So that's Smarty Grants, the people who run the grant management program. They're really good. They're not like Vodafone or Telstra. If you call them up using the phone number through the link there, it's a Victorian number. They pretty much always answer. If they don't answer straight away, they respond. They call you back very quickly, and they're very friendly and they're very helpful. So yeah, so those are the main places you can go to support. I can't emphasize enough. We don't want people dying wondering. If you've got a question that you want to know the answer to, don't spend ages mulling it around in your mind and wasting your organization's time and your own time. Just reach out to us and ask the question. The people who answer your questions will not be assessing your grant. So you will not that will not, if you ask, don't need to worry about the fact that your question is silly or that your question might betray that you're not sure whether you're eligible or not. Just put up your hand and come to us and ask a question. We're more than happy to help, whether it's us in the Sydney Parramatta office or it's one of the district support officers on the ground who have that increased local knowledge. Okay, so yeah, after this, we'll do a quick run through of what it's like to actually go through the application form. But in the meantime, before we get to that, did anyone have any questions they want to ask? You can either put your hand up or turn your microphone off or ask or put it in the chat, whichever suits. Mark.
Just interested in, it's sort of related to the subcontractors. Does the subcontractor have to be a New South Wales registered business? Because I'm thinking about our southern border and the subcontracting we can occasionally do with Victorian-based businesses.
Yeah, no, they don't have to be New South Wales based. And that's also the reason why it can even involve individuals or even in limited, you'd have to have a good reason, but a commercial enterprise would also be okay. Because for us, our contractual relationship is with you. So we need to make sure that you tick all our boxes. But as far as who you're subcontracted with, as long as we know the details of who they are, in the form you get to write just what the organization name is, and you be ticking a box that basically says we understand that we are subcontracting our services and our grant our contracting arrangement will be with DCJ. As long as that's fine, then yeah, it's absolutely fine if they're across the border in Victoria.
Thank you.
No worries. Did anyone else have any questions? Okay. Well, maybe then we'll roll on to, we've been having some technical issues this morning, so we'll see how this goes. So I apologize if there's any problems, but Ella from my team is going to do a run through of what it's like to go through the application process. We'll hope all our IT systems work nicely today. This afternoon. But thanks, Ella.
Yes, let's see how we go. All right, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to start off on the NGO flood recovery landing page here. So this page, it's got, all the in-depth information about the grant, including the grant guidelines here and the frequently asked questions. So we just advise before you start your application for you to read these. They're just really, really important before you start. And then if we click on this link here, it'll take you to the Smarty Grants online grants portal. So up here, you can preview the form, and you can also download a PDF version of the form before you start an application. So the good thing is downloading a preview of the form. This is just a really great option if you want other people in your organisation to give you input or feedback on how to reply to questions. So you can print off a few copies and share them, and you can then combine these responses to put in your application form. So let's start a submission. See if it loads. It's quite slow today. Yes. So if you haven't registered in Smarty Grants before, you'll just follow the prompts here. Otherwise, you just log in with your credentials. So this first page, it just gives you an overview of the flood recovery program, and you can save and close at any time during the application process. So if you log out, just make sure you log back into Smarty Grants using the email address that you used to create the application. So to navigate back to the application you started, just click on My Submissions at the top of the page, and this will save you from starting a new submission from scratch. And also, as Dan mentioned before, just note that DCJ will only accept one submission per applicant. So just review in the My Submissions section that there's only one application for the NGO Flood Recovery Grant Program. So if you just go in there, we can go back into your application. So on this page, you've got all the instructions and details about the flood recovery program, and it's also got our contact email address. So if you have any questions at all about the application process, as Dan was saying, it doesn't matter how small your query might be, just please reach out to us. We're more than willing to help you and support you with the process. We know that the grant application process can be quite daunting, so that's the email address there. You'll see at the bottom of the page here is your submission number. So just take a note of this number, because whenever you're emailing us, we'll always ask for this number. So yeah, that's quite important to take note of that. So if you go to the next page. So on the second page, you're required to input your organisation name and ABN details. In the next section, you are asked if you've been invited by DCJ to apply for a closed competitive grant. So as this is the closed competitive grant information session, you should all be ticking yes to this question. Then it'll pop up how much funding you're invited to apply for. So you just click on how much. Next, you're going to be inputting your bank details, organisation contact details, and which district you are located in. And then you'll select which LGAs your organisation currently serves. You can select as many LGAs as required, and note that only the LGAs in the 4 eligible districts will be listed here. So if your organisation primarily provides services for Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander communities and people, or culturally and linguistically diverse groups, please ensure you tick one of these options. If you are subcontracting another organisation to receive funding, just include their details in the section here. And if your organisation can't confirm if they've been public identified to as declining to join the New South Wales National Redress Scheme, or if you have any outstanding acquittals due to DCJ, these, if you put in no or yes here, you may be deemed ineligible to apply for this grant. And just here, you want to ensure you're attaching your current and not expired certificate of currency documentation. So if we go to the next page, the first question here in this section requests how you plan to use the funding. So just provide information here on the work this funding will enable, what funding will be spent on, and the people that will be assisted. This should include which cohort, community, and/or geographical area the funding will be directed towards. In this section here, if you answered yes on the previous page that you are applying for a closed competitive grant, then it'll come up here that you can choose if you would like your application assessed for both an open and closed competitive grant, or just a closed competitive grant. So we've done this in order to give closed competitive grant invitees the best chance of successfully obtaining a grant. But if you wish, you can opt out and only be considered for a closed competitive grant. That's up to you. If you click yes, then it'll give you the options here of how much funding you would like to be considered for in the open competitive round. So that should be that section there. The assessment criteria section asks you to answer 5 questions that correlate to the assessment criteria. So each answer must be between 50 to 200 words, except for question 5, which is just a tick a box. So just make sure you read the hints under each question. And these hints will give you an idea of what you need to include in your answers. So the assessment criteria, it also applies to any individual organisations with whom the applicant has a subcontracting relationship, but the contractual responsibility for meeting these criteria will sit with the applicant organisation. Next bit here, just please be aware of what the grant funds cannot be used for. And then it just mentions here up to 25% of the funds you request can be used for reimbursement costs for any flood costs your organisation has accumulated since September 2022. So just ensure you put that amount into the expenditure table here. And the items you list in this table should be as high level as possible. So there's no need to go into too much detail. And we've allowed this to ensure the funding can be used as flexibly as possible. Then we just want to make sure this amount here adds up to the amount that you are requesting. So on to the last page of the application form. So this page, you're just required to input the details of the 2 people who will be signing the grant funding agreement if you are awarded funding. So it's very important that the 2 authorised signatories are a member of the board from your organisation. And if you need any more clarification around the requirements of an authorised signatory, you can visit the DCJ website. Just click on the link here. And there's also an option a bit further down here, which allows you, if you'd like another individual other than the 2 authorised signatories from your org to review the grant funding agreement before it's signed. So you could input their details in this little section here. So then before you submit your application, it will you'll be asked to review your responses. So make sure that all attachments are included and that you have answered each question fully. And if you have any incomplete mandatory fields before you submit, you'll be prompted to fill out these sections, and you can see here these sections are all highlighted in red, and it will tell you to go back to the page where you need to input your response. So once you submit your application form, so once all these have been updated, you can click submit. You will get an email from Smarty Grants confirming your submission. Just note that once you have submitted your application, you are no longer able to edit your application. So make sure you're happy with the information you've provided. Once again, if you have any questions, please email us here, spcgrantsteam@fax.nsw.gov.au. I'm more than happy to run through the Smarty Grants process with you one more time if you need to via MS Teams, or if you'd like more assistance with the application process, anything at all, just email us. Yeah, don't hesitate to get in touch. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ella. That's great. So yes, that brings us to the end of our session. I want to check to make sure, did anyone have any questions in relation to anything that Ella went through or anything else? Okay, great. So that's the end of our presentation. I'll give you back 15 odd minutes in your day. I know we've kept on having this point home, but we are here to provide support. Please do contact us if you need any assistance. Especially if you have any questions about particular details, like the question you were asking before, Mark. One of those things would take you quite a while to work out if you try to go through all that paperwork to work it out, but it's much easier just to quickly ask us the question. On that basis, if everyone's okay, I think, and so we will, while this session's being recorded, we probably won't send out the, great, cheers, Mark. We probably won't send out recording of this particular session because we've done a previous one and we'll send it through to you, but we will send you later this afternoon, or might be slightly early into the evening, a copy of the recording of the last one and a copy of what the presentation looks like and stuff like that, just so you've got that on board. But thank you all. Appreciate your attendance. Let us know if you have any queries. Otherwise, in contact later. Cheers.